Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for letting me waste your time this afternoon. But before we get started, I need a little help from the audience. If you see any stray worms that came out of the can prior to the break, would you please help collect them and bring them down to the front? We lost some. We let a few out of the can earlier, didn't we? This is entitled Dynamic Bracing: A New Vision for Conservative Treatment. And the first thing maybe to do is to tell you what dynamic bracing is. And by the way, in the interests of true disclosure, first of all, I've been an orthopedic product manufacturer and designer for 38 years. I have a 100% financial interest in everything that comes out of my mouth. So hopefully you won't believe what comes out of my mouth, but let's look at what the evidence leads us to and what has come out of the mouth and the research studies of others. So anyway, let's just do a little definition of what this is all about. At first, what is dynamic bracing? A lot of us have the misconception it's some spring exercise or things that we work against or help us to augment or something in our practice. But that's not how we define it. In reality, dynamic bracing is the use of movement or muscle power to apply a force at the moment of need, and then to take that force away when it's not needed. Okay? So essentially, we're just using muscles to work against pathology. Now, come on, machine. There we go. Everybody knows the quadriceps cause a problem in terms of if subluxing the tibia anteriorly in the last 30 degrees. And good old Dave Beard, I knew him well back when he started this. The hamstring's reflex is 2 to 3 times slower in an ACL deficient knee, so we have a timing problem. Pardon me, my machine's, there we go. There are 4 things that an ACL deficient patient cannot do, right? He can't stop, he can't run downhill, which is just like stopping. He can't land from a jump, and he can't move laterally. And if you look at them on their surface, it's rather strange because running downhill and stopping, it's very difficult to hit the foot flat or even on the ball of the foot. You almost always have to hit a little bit on the heel, and that would tend to induce subluxation. Whereas landing from a jump and moving lateral, you hit on the ball of the foot, you create a ground reaction force that would tend to reduce the tibia. So why should all 4 of those things produce the same result? And the reason is the tibia is already subluxed before the foot ever hit the ground. Now, I postulated that during some talks many years ago in the late 90s, but I didn't have any evidence for it until I started working with Bob Jackson in Dallas and helped him shrink his little instrumented spatial linkage device into something that was small and useful. And this is one of the second papers that Bob did using this little ISLD, as Bob called it. And if you look very carefully at this, you'll notice that on the left, there's heel strike. The right is heel strike, the same cycle, same knee. And the green, of course, is the unaffected leg. The horizontal line is neutral tibial position at 30 degrees of flexion. And you see the tracing of the 2 knees, left and right. The affected leg is in red on the top. And if you look very carefully at heel strike, lo and behold, there it was. It's subluxed. Goes all the way through, right here, boom, extends again, subluxes, hits the ground. That particular leg is symptomatic. We had a lot of ACL deficient knees that were not. And the ACL deficient knees in that study that were not did not show that. They controlled it. So it led us to thinking about some things that are a little bit different. Incidentally, Tom Andriacu confirmed that same thing with a 12-camera system about 5 years after that. So compression of the condyles at foot strike after it's subluxed now is a tremendous stabilizer, and it prevents joint reduction until you get further into flexion. We know from Hirakawa that the hamstrings are totally worthless from 15 degrees to full extension, and the more severe a sport you play, the more time that elite athlete is going to spend in that last 15 degrees at the limits with no control over it. So if he has a timing problem, we're in trouble. So what the dynamic brace is designed to do is to apply a load posteriorly to stop the tibia from subluxing prior to foot strike so that the foot can hit and compress the joint completely in a stable condition. And Markov told us that they could reduce strain on the ACL 30 to 50%. If you turn that around, it's just like saying, well, if the joint is compressed and in conjugate position, it takes 1.5 to 2 times the force to fail it. That's a tremendous stabilizer. So it can either work against us or it can work with us. So if we stop the subluxation prior to foot strike, we stop the whole chain of events that occurs after that. And we've been witness to that in a lot of instances. This is a dynamic brace. If you concentrate on the small silver lever, you'll notice that in flexion, the silver lever is hanging out the front. And now if you go into extension, whoops, I guess it didn't continue looping, did it? Let's do it one more time. All right, we'll go on. It's okay, it only looped one time. If you continue doing this, what you'll find out is that in flexion, you don't have any problem. There it goes, thank you. Magically appeared again. So you can see the action of the mechanism. We apply this for ACLs in flexion. And that's the neutral point. As we extend, it pushes the tibia back. I can apply the exact same device without doing anything else to it in extension. And I require one additional strap right up there for the PCL side of things. So let's think for a moment. This is great for ACL. It pushes the ACL, pushes the tibia back as you extend. Now reverse it, and let's put it on an extension and watch what happens. It's not going to go, is it? It's going here. There we go. As you flex, it pushes the tibia forward. So the difference between using something like this for ACL and PCL is how you apply it, at what point in the range of motion, and where the neutral point is. So if I start at 90, and that's my neutral point, and I extend, I get a posteriorly directed tibial force. And the femur obviously is being pushed anteriorly. If I apply it in extension, and I form a ring around the distal quadriceps and the hamstrings to prevent proximal sliding of the device, then as I flex, it will push the tibia anteriorly, driven against that ring. So this is an example of a dynamic brace for ACL, but that's not the only thing dynamic braces can be used for. All right, let's see if this will go on. There we go. This is from Stephanie Osierno, Moshe Slomanow, Bob D'Ambrosia, and Chris D'Ambrosia, the guys at LSU. This particular study used a dynamic brace on patients that had quadriceps inhibition that was severe, and all of them ACL deficient, all of them symptomatic. And using these types of dynamic braces, they were able to do maximal effort isokinetic extensions with no inhibitions and no subluxations. In these particular patients, the symptoms are severely reduced or completely eliminated in many cases. So it has a place. It has a place in areas where you can't or don't want to have the reconstruction, or you have to protect the knee long enough for the reconstruction to take place, particularly in areas where we have to wait to have the surgery. It's hard for some of these 13-year-old kids to be slowed down long enough to prevent them from damaged menisci and other things. So why would we need to use dynamic bracing? Why is it necessary? Well, the strap tension that's necessary to control the tibia in a typical 180-pound male athlete is about 3 times the force that it takes to stop circulation. So if I try to tighten something statically with a strap, I cut circulation off and the patient is completely uncomfortable. So I have to apply a force and get a peak that's so high it cannot be tolerated for long periods. But as soon as you're back into a flexed ready position, force goes away, circulation is returned, everybody's great. And the patient likes that because it feels stable. It locks him in tight. So static or passive braces can't do it. And I know it, we make those too. This is an interesting thing that Slomanow found out in using these types of devices. When you do rapid extensions to cut, turn, twist, or stop, a rapid extension creating a very rapid rise in strap force in the posterior hamstring strap causes a tonic reflex to occur. Now this was published in this particular outgoing presidential paper by Moshe in the ISEK Congress. It's a wonderful compendium of the complete history of ligamentous structures as neurosensory devices. You actually can get Pavlov's dog response from doing this, and patients who can wear it can actually take it off, and the response remains for several days. They learn to fire their hamstrings automatically. It's not permanent, it has to be retrained. But we have instances where we've actually used it with patients who practice both with and without. You can't practice without a brace. Practice with a brace and play without. That's an immediate failure. They'll tear everything else up. But if you practice with and without and build up their patterning and their proprioception and build up the auto training, they can play without for short periods of time safely. It turns a non-coper into a coper, basically. Let me jump over and take this same dynamic principle one step farther. OA is a big problem. You know about all this. On the conservative end of the spectrum, bracing is about the only thing that doesn't really have a lot of mortality or morbidity. It's targeted, conservative, non-invasive, and it can be used alone or in combination with other things. There's some information going on right now with research studies that show that hyaluronic acid, which has been undergone a lot of controversy, does much better at much higher rates when you combine it with offloading. Hopefully that study will be out before too long. It can also be used if you've got a high tibial osteotomy you did and you still have subsequent pain. You can test to find out if the remainder of the pain is still caused by some unicompartmental pathology. Now, force is possible only in extension in these types of osteoarthritic braces. So as long as the leg is in the last 20 or 30 degrees, you can do it. But those of you that do a varus valgus stress test know that if you get the knee too flexed, it just rolls at the hip. And that's precisely what occurs with a brace. If you flex the knee too far, the brace simply rolls as relief of the difference in angle between the brace and the leg. And sometimes it doesn't roll back. So that sets a natural limit in terms of what you can do. So again, we'll use dynamic bracing principles to apply a force in the moment of need. As we extend, we'll apply a varus valgus load. As we flex, we take the load away. It tends to check any angular rotation that might occur. And this is just one type. There's all kinds of osteoarthritic braces: push, pull, both, right? Dynamic, static, soft, hard, single upright, double upright. What's all the confusion? Each one has slightly different things that it does and does well. Everything from mild to moderate patients all the way up. This was first studied back doing video fluoroscopy by Doug Dennis and his group up at, with Richard Comastek at the Rocky Mountain Musculoskeletal Labs, where the patients walk on a treadmill with a video fluoroscope. And they use both a 2D and 3D technique to do this. I got very intimately involved in a lot of this stuff. Come on, there we go. The accuracies of the 2D technique are about 0.4 of a millimeter. 3D technique is about 0.2 of a millimeter. In both cases, we put plastic spacers in the cadaver knees that are known thickness and invisible to the fluoroscope. And then we manipulate the cadaver knee to look like it's going through a particular gait cycle, and then look at it in the fluoroscope and compare that, what we calculate with the known. It's not something that anybody judges because computer masks, they're there to match the video image. And the computer masks then calculate the delta opening. So here's some patient walking along without a brace. Whoops. Okay, without a brace, with the brace, and he continues on. Let's go ahead and there we go. So this is a heel strike image. Heel strike and mid stance are the two big humps of the camel in the gait cycle. And you can see on the left, there's a bone-on-bone patient. And here you can see the angle of the hinge holding the same thing open. When you do this a number of times, and now it's been repeated multiple times, you find out that we can actually hold 78% of the knees open at least 0.4 millimeters, which is the margin of error of the study, or more. Okay? About 92% of the patients respond that they get significant pain relief enough to want to continue using the device. And the ones that you cannot open are the heavier patients. No, and sometimes much heavier. But just because you can't hold them completely open doesn't mean you can't reduce enough pressure to eliminate their pain on walking. And you're doing them a disservice if you let them walk out of the office with pain and they're moderate to severe and they can't have the surgery yet, and you can't send them out without pain. Something's wrong. Okay? They don't need the brace. The brace needs to come back. We don't need to be charging for things that don't work. This was repeated by the JBJS study. The actual editorial board contacted Dr. Comastek and said, hey, our people want to know which braces are working and why and how they work. Do they work? We want it very fair. You guys did a technique that can't be fooled and it doesn't require human intervention to calculate openings. We'd like you to do it, but we want you to do it on 5 moderate to severe OA patients, unicompartmental, and every patient is to receive every brace. Every brace is to be put on by a designated expert of the company that provides that brace. Okay? And then they're all to be allowed to walk as necessary on the fluoroscope to come up with their result. All of them had CT scans, and bony models were made of their knee, and those were used as the masks for rotational placement and fitting on the video images. And then the computer then calculates the actual proximity of the joint opening. At heel strike, the dynamic type braces have the highest separation. By the time we moved to mid stance, the dynamic braces were the only ones that could produce enough to open the knee greater than the margin of error of the study. Okay. And finally, when you get all the way to just before toe off, it's considerably higher than the next closest one and still performing. So, okay, so now you've heard that sort of evidence. And let me just say that this is not a treatise to get up here and say you all need to be using OA braces. There are times when you use an OA brace. There are times when you don't. There are times when you need an ACL brace or a PCL brace, and times when you don't. I would much rather that all the physicians learn when they can use such technology and when they shouldn't. And if it doesn't work, we need to find ways to take it back. So it's economical to the system, and it benefits you, benefits the patient, benefits the system, et cetera. NIH is rather unique in the world at having so many employees, if you will, but and the total vast amounts of data that are easily accessible. Interesting study is that they did a few years ago. For every dollar that they spent on these types of soft devices or bracing devices, they save 4 to 5 times that amount of dollars later on. So it has a place. It is just another arrow in your quiver and is not intended to be, the answer to anything or everything. So I'm here just to tell you that there are possibilities and that we can prove those possibilities on your patients, and that's the only thing that you should believe. You don't need a $500,000 study if all your patients work correctly, right? We don't need those controlled studies with meta-analysis if every patient walks out without pain. Okay, anyway, you've been a great audience. I want to thank you very much for your time and hope to talk to you again in the future. Okay, thank you.